This is the second video in Molecules of Life, or Organic Molecules. This one is about carbohydrates and lipids. So, as we said before, there are four categories of organic compounds: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Today we're going to talk about carbohydrates and lipids. Carbohydrates are named from their basic formula, which is CH2O. Carbo meaning carbon, and hydrate means water, right? And if you look, you can see if you remove this carbon, then you'll have water. So carbon plus water. The functional groups that are found in carbohydrates are hydroxyls and carbonyls. Okay, and you'll find both of those in different kinds of molecules within the carbohydrate group. The monomers, or the small molecules, the small building blocks of the larger molecules, are called monosaccharides. Mono means one, and the saccharide refers to a sugar. And so the basic molecular formula for a monosaccharide is CH2O. There are some differences between monosaccharides, and there are some that are a little bit different than that, but most of them have the same number of carbons and oxygens and twice as many hydrogens as either one of those. Okay. There are a lot of monosaccharides that have the same molecular formula but different structural formulas. We call those isomers, remember. And the function of carbohydrates in general is the main fuel for molecule for cells. Glucose is kind of the preferred fuel for most cells, although they can use others as well. But this is the main function of carbohydrates in general, especially for the monosaccharides. Here are two monosaccharides that are glucose and fructose. It says glucose here is an aldose. That means it's got this carbonyl group on the final carbon. And fructose is a ketose, which means the carbonyl group is on an interior carbon. This particular one is in the second carbon. So if you look at them and count up how many carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, you'll find that they have the same molecular formula, C6H12O6. They have a similar name, glucose, fructose. And you'll find that sugars in general end in OSE. And of course, the ketone versus the aldehyde thing, glucose is an aldose or an aldehyde type sugar, and fructose is a ketose or a ketone type sugar. You're not going to have to worry too much about the aldose and the ketose thing, but you do need to realize that they can have the same structural, the same molecular formula in different structures and have different names. So you should know OSE refers to a sugar. Now, disaccharides are made from two monosaccharides joined together by dehydration synthesis, as we learned in the last lesson. There are lots of examples of disaccharides. Maltose is one, malt sugar. Sucrose, which is the table sugar that we use when you put sugar in your iced tea or sugar on your Cheerios for breakfast in the morning. And another one is lactose, which is found in milk and other kinds of dairy products. Those are all disaccharides made from two monosaccharides that are put together by dehydration synthesis. Here's maltose. Maltose is made from adding two glucose molecules together, and the dehydration synthesis reaction binds those two molecules together to make one disaccharide, maltose. Generally speaking, disaccharides are sweeter in taste than monosaccharides, but they're both sugar. They're both types of sugar. Now, there are also polysaccharides. Poly means many or a lot, as you might have learned before, and polysaccharides can be chains of hundreds to thousands of monosaccharides, and they have two main functions in living organisms. One really important function of polysaccharides is as a storage molecule. It's a place to store extra sugar until you need to use it. Starch in plants, plant starch that you have like in potatoes or other kinds of plant products that you eat, are made of polysaccharides. In animals, there's a type of storage starch called glycogen, and we'll talk more about both of these later on as we talk about the different kinds of organisms, but you'll find starch and glycogen in plants and in animals. It's really easy to remove monosaccharides from these storage molecules with an enzyme that does hydrolysis to separate off the glucoses as you need them. So when you're exercising, for instance, and you feel that kind of dip, then that's probably because your blood sugar has dropped and your liver gets a message that says, give me some of that glycogen where I can get some extra sugar from my cellular respiration to give me more energy. And so it releases some of that, and it's broken down into glucose, which enters your bloodstream and gives you a little burst of energy. There are also polysaccharides that are structural molecules, and a really good example of this is cellulose in plants. Now this is one of the main structural molecules that makes up cell walls. It makes up a large part of like wood and other kinds of fibrous type things that make up plants. Here's the thing, animals can't break down cellulose. We don't have the right enzyme. It's still made of molecules of glucose that are put together, but they're put together in a different way with a different kind of bond, and the enzymes that we have in our cells don't work to break down the cellulose. Now, there are some animals like cows and other kinds of animals that eat a lot of plants that have these symbiotic bacteria that live inside their intestines that can help them break down the cellulose. And so cows, it says here cows and termites, you can also think about other things that eat grass, have these kinds of symbiotic bacteria that can help them break it down. Another type of structural polysaccharide is something called chitin. I know the word here looks like chitin, but it's chitin, and this is found in the cell walls of fungi, mushrooms and molds and things like that, and also in the exoskeletons or the shells of arthropods like insects and crabs and lobsters. So there are different kinds of structural molecules, but they're both polysaccharides. Here we see an example of how those are arranged. Okay, you see here's the starch that you would find in a potato, and you'll see how the glucose molecules are attached together like that. Glycogen is similar, except glycogen has these branching chains, but they're put together a similar way. But in cellulose, it's put together a little bit differently. Notice the position of the oxygens kind of alternates back and forth here, and they also can form these hydrogen bonds between the chains, so it makes a really strong fiber that can be very good for support. Now, another kind of organic molecule that is important to living things is something called a lipid. A lipid, we generally think about lipids as being fats or oils, things like that. They're basically long hydrocarbon chains that are non-polar, covalent bonded together, and they're pretty hydrophobic. If you think about if you ever put oil and water together, the oil and water separate, and yes, the oil floats on top because it's less dense, but they separate because the oil is non-polar, so it doesn't mix with the water. It's hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. Lipids aren't really macromolecules. They're a little bit smaller than that, but we include them in this group because they're still made of smaller parts that get put together. Examples of lipids include fats, which include oils and waxes and things like that, phospholipids, which make up the cell membranes, and another group called the steroids, which make up things like hormones and cholesterol and things like that. Lipids are excellent for energy storage. They store actually more energy than starches do or than sugars do, that they have to go through a little bit more processing to make the right kind of molecule to produce energy, but they can be a good source of energy as storage. There are some lipids that are really, really important in how cells are put together in certain kinds of cell structures, and we'll talk more about this as we talk more about cells. Now, there are fats and oils, which are types of lipids. These are made of two types of smaller molecules, glycerol and fatty acids. A glycerol is a 3-carbon molecule that, with that OL ending, it's basically like an alcohol. It has 3 hydroxyl groups attached to each one hydroxyl attached to each of these carbons. Fatty acids are long hydrocarbon chains, well, 16 to 18 carbons long, okay, and they have a carboxyl group on one end. The hydrocarbon chains sometimes are called saturated or unsaturated. The saturated fats means that there are no carbon-to-carbon double bonds in that chain. And these saturated fats are solids at room temperature. Things like shortening and butter and things like that are saturated fats. They're saturated with hydrogen. Every bonding place that can have a hydrogen attached to it has a hydrogen attached to it. And there are no carbon-to-carbon double bonds. The only double bond you'll see in a saturated fatty acid is the double bond with the oxygen in the carboxyl group. Unsaturated fats have one or more carbon-to-carbon double bonds in that chain. These are liquids at room temperature. Now, when you think about what's important in your diet, we try to eat more unsaturated fats than saturated fats. But there are good unsaturated fats and there are bad unsaturated fats as well, and we'll talk some more about those in class. Here's how the glycerol and the fatty acid are put together. Notice again we've got a dehydration reaction occurring here between the hydrogen of one of those hydroxyl groups on a glycerol with the hydroxyl group of the carboxyl group on the end of the fatty acid. Okay, each one of those hydroxyl groups on the carboxyl can join with a hydroxyl group from the carboxyl group on the fatty acid to make a water molecule. It takes 3 fatty acids to fill up one glycerol, and that forms a fat called a triglyceride. Tri meaning 3, glyceride meaning it's 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol. This is the basic kind of fats that we generally have in our diet. Here's a picture of a triglyceride. There are 3 fatty acids joined here. Notice that 2 of these are saturated fatty acids, meaning they have no carbon-to-carbon double bonds anywhere in the chain, and this one has 1 carbon-to-carbon double bond right here, and so this is an unsaturated fatty acid. Polyunsaturated fats are ones that have more than 1 fatty acid that with double bonds in the chain. The reason that the unsaturated fatty acids are liquids at room temperature and the saturated ones are solids is that when you don't have this little kink in the chain that is caused by this double bond here, they can pack more closely together, and that's what makes them be solids at room temperature, whereas the ones that have a double bond or more than 1 double bond have a little kink in the shape of the chain here, and they can't pack together quite as tightly, and that's what makes them liquids at room temperature. Here we have straight hydrocarbon chains packed tightly together. Now, saturated fats can form plaques in your blood vessels that can lead to cardiovascular disease. This is something we need to be careful about in our diet. Make sure we don't eat too many saturated fats. It's not terrible to eat some saturated fats, and there are a lot of things that have saturated fats in them, but you want to try to keep it on the lower side in terms of your diet. The unsaturated fats have these bends or these kinks in the hydrocarbon chain. And so these are less likely to cause health problems, but there are some that can be bad. Now, the monounsaturated fats have 1 carbon-to-carbon double bond, and those are really probably the best ones for you in terms of your health. Polyunsaturated fats have 2 or more carbon-to-carbon double bonds. And then there are ones called omega-3 fatty acids, and those are ones that are really special. They're often found in things like fish and nuts. They're definitely something that's important in your diet. They actually help protect you against cardiovascular disease, but we don't make them naturally. We have to eat them. And so they're necessary to have in your diet. The omega-3 is talking about where exactly that double bond is found, and it's found in a special place. There are also something called trans fats, and trans fats are a little bit unsaturated, but they've been unsaturated because of an artificial addition of hydrogen, and they have formed bonds actually between those hydrocarbon chains, and those can be really harmful to your health. And so we're not going to focus on those, but that is something when you're looking at food products to look for trans fats, and trans fats are not good fats to have in your foods. Now, phospholipids are a special kind of lipid that we're going to be spending quite a bit of time talking about pretty soon. These contain glycerol and 2 fatty acids plus a phosphate group attached to one of those carbons in the glycerol molecule. So here you see the phosphate group with a couple of other things attached to it there, attached to part of the glycerol, and then we have 2 fatty acids. One is saturated, one is unsaturated here. What this makes is a molecule that has a dual personality. It has a head that is hydrophilic, that means it's polar and it can mix very well with water, and a tail that is hydrophobic, means it doesn't like water, it's not polar at all. And these are important because they're the major components of what your cell membranes are made of. Your cell membrane is made of something called a phospholipid bilayer. Bilayer meaning it has 2 layers. They're organized so that the hydrophilic heads are toward the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell, and the tails are in between the hydrophilic heads. This makes a really nice watertight barrier for the cell. There are ways to get through it, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the cell membrane. But the phospholipids are very, very important in a lot of ways, and that's the main reason for them is because they form the cell membrane that separates all our cells. There are also steroids. And steroids, we saw pictures of these earlier when we talked about the general groups. They have a carbon skeleton that is 4 fused rings. It's based on something called cholesterol. Basically, this is a basic one, cholesterol here. There are lots of different kinds of steroids that have different kinds of functional groups. Remember when we talked about functional groups, we saw the different functional groups that you found on 2 hormones in our humans, the testosterone and the estradiol. This one is cholesterol, okay? And cholesterol is important. It gets a bad rap because if you have too much of it, it's bad for your health. But it actually is a necessary component of cell membranes, and we'll talk more about that again when we talk about cell membranes. And of course, steroid hormones, testosterone and estrogen that we talked about before. Again, they're going to vary in these functional groups that are attached there. Now, there are also anabolic steroids, and you probably have heard of these as well. These are synthetic variants of testosterone. One thing that testosterone does in both males and females, because we all have a little bit of both hormones, testosterone promotes muscle growth and bone buildup. And that's important to building your body the way your body grows as you're growing up. Anabolic steroids do mimic some of these effects, and so it sounds like they might be pretty beneficial if you're trying to bulk up. They can be used as a prescription to treat various kinds of medical conditions, but notice what it says here, for a limited time. Whenever you take some kind of a steroid medication, there's always a limited amount of time that you take it, and oftentimes you'll take a dosage and then they'll wean you down over the course of a couple of days to take less and less and less. If you use these for too long, they can have very negative effects like infertility, negative personality changes. You've heard of roid rage before, because people take those steroid hormones and they get angry for no reason at all. If you use it in your teen years, it can actually cause your bones to stop growing. And that's a really important thing to think about, okay? Because guys, you don't stop growing until you're about 20, generally speaking, 20 or maybe even a little bit above that. You wouldn't want to stop growing before you've reached your final growth stage. So it's really important to be careful about that. Girls, it could have the same effect on you, although girls usually stop growing a little bit earlier. But it's really important to avoid those because they can be very, very harmful to you. And we'll talk some more about these in class. That ends today's lesson.